DEFA Minister Clare Barber joins me on Agenda this week to talk about a new Fisheries Management Agreement and more tweaking of the planning system. We'll talk about fish later, but first a consultation is open on the Government Consultation Hub, which is looking at increasing planning fees as well as making a few improvements to the system. Why has this consultation been brought forward?
There's been a few things that have come in over the last probably 6 months to a year, certainly since the Built Environment Reform programme's been going, where there's obvious things that just need tidying up, and a few other areas where we felt that there may be some scope for a change. So we thought now is the time to pull those bits together, put a consultation out, and then we'll review the responses and make a call as to how we proceed.
Part of the change is possibly a headline grabber, streamlining how DEFA applications are dealt with so there is more resource to focus on delivering planning services to the public. So effectively what's being proposed here is that the Planning Committee can consider DEFA planning applications, and yet the Planning Committee sits under DEFA. Is there a conflict there?
So certainly, you say it sits under DEFA, and I suppose in terms of a technicality, that could be the description. But, certainly I haven't had any engagement with the Planning Committee in terms of since I've been in post. I don't meet them regularly. I don't see the papers that go to them because obviously I would be engaged in the appeals element. We've separated the Planning Committee chair from DEFA. So historically, it wasn't set down in any rules anywhere, but historically the chair of planning also sat as the planning and building control political member in DEFA. So that was a very early decision I took, that I felt actually having a separate chair of planning made a lot of sense. So obviously at the minute we've got Rob Callister in that role, and he's not sitting in DEFA. He hasn't sat in DEFA since I've been there, and actually I think that provides a more healthy relationship. So that allows him to be the political conduit for the Planning Committee. If there are any concerns around process or so on, then he can contact directly into planning, or he can come via myself, but we don't meet regularly to discuss planning because I think it's absolutely right that the committee are able to make those decisions absolutely unfettered by any external body.
Having been a planning minister myself, planning ministers did regularly meet with the planning committee to primarily not to discuss planning applications, but to discuss the generality, if you like, the detail as to what was working and what was not working and how particular problems were arising. So how does that get fed through at a political level?
So interestingly, I have had one email very recently actually from Rob, which I've spoken to him about, which was around the time frame. So again, a process thing, the time frame from when they receive documents relating to the applications versus when they have to hear them. So asking whether we can increase the time, especially for complex applications, because those sometimes are coming in quite late in the week with the meeting then on Monday, which is then meaning that the committee only really have a choice to roll that forward another 2 weeks, which causes a delay. So that's something that we're really keen to work on, but certainly from a political perspective, it's absolutely not appropriate for me to be meeting with the committee. I don't feel that's the right route in, and I feel the only things really from the committee's perspective that they should be referring into DEFA should be relating to process, and if there's anything where they feel that there's a problem with policy, obviously that would go to Cabinet Office. And actually I think having that separation, as I say, between the planning chair and the political member in planning, I think has worked well, but it's obviously important we pick up the process, because if things aren't working because they haven't got papers early enough, then of course I want to do something to resolve that.
So the other changes include things like review the ability to trigger or participate in an appeal. So this is looking at interested person status amongst other things. What's the thinking behind this?
So there's been a number of points around this. Some of the things we're clarifying is around the 21-day wait after an application's been approved. If there's no one who has an appeal mechanism, why are we waiting 21 days when we could progress quite quickly? There's a question around who should have the rights to have an appeal, and there's a number of different options that we've looked at in that regard. We're not hugely uncomfortable with where we're at, but I think it's absolutely right we sense check that and talk to the public and see what comes back. I know that the planning team feel that it's sort of once every political administration we should have a thorough look through planning and if there's anything we want to change. And this gave us a vehicle, gave us the opportunity to do that. I think it would also just be worth actually just going back actually on the DEFA applications. One of the interesting things is I think when people think of DEFA applications, we think of DEFA wanting to build something on our land, and yet what we've had recently as an example is actually someone wanting to build a toilet facility who's a tenant on DEFA land, who's then got to go through quite an onerous process in terms of us bringing the appeals inspector in, going straight through, and also not having any appeals function, because that would then have to go straight to a dolence claim. So it means that people who are tenants of DEFA land actually are probably disadvantaged under the current system. So providing a different function, different mechanism, I think would be very helpful for a number of people, because as you'll know yourself, we do have quite a few tenants actually within DEFA.
The converse of that is if, for example, the department decided it wanted to build a new headquarters, perhaps that's getting a bit too close, bearing in mind that all the legislations surrounding the planning committee and the appointments and everything are very much under your control as minister. Maybe something like that might be a bit too close to the bone in terms of consideration.
And of course there would still be the opportunity there for council ministers to make a determination to call such an application in. Certainly if it was a bigger application, that function would sit, and we know that that sits embedded in the legislation. But I suppose that's really the point we're consulting. That's why we're asking the question. We can certainly see that there would potentially be some benefit to having a shift. We don't feel that the conflict in terms of the planning committee exists. We believe the planning committee are absolutely empowered to act independently, and that's absolutely how it must be and how it must remain. But also it would, we believe, free up some time in terms of the preparation of documents, in terms of instructing an appeals inspector to take that on as an application. And we hope, as I say, speed up more generally the process, which is very much where the Built Environment Reform Programme piece comes about. And
you mentioned earlier about the fast-track household appeals process. 3 weeks, which effectively is the cut-off point at the moment, 21 days after the notification is given that a decision has been made, you have that 21 days to make an appeal. 3 weeks isn't that long, particularly bearing in mind that people do go away on holiday and potentially could be away for 2 weeks, and then they come back and find that they may need to consider an appeal. And sometimes these appeals can be quite costly affairs for people producing evidence and developing a case. Is there a big pressure to alter that 3 weeks?
So this is very much though around those people where there isn't anyone who would have a right to an appeal. So it's if the householder isn't going to appeal the decision themselves because it's, I would assume, in favour of their decision, then we would essentially allow that fast track. There would be no one else then who would hold the right to appeal, because if they hadn't made a representation early on. So I suppose what we're trying to avoid is someone who hasn't considered the item at the point of an application at all. So all through the planning process there's been nothing there, and then suddenly at an appeal stage decides to come in and lodge an appeal. So I think it's not just the 21 days. There would have been the process at which planning goes through, which, as we know, I know we aim for 8 weeks, but in reality with some of the changes that people might submit around an application, it can be considerably longer, which I think is reasonable for people to have come up with any objections they have within that time frame. And if they're lodged, then this wouldn't be available to the householder.
Okay. The thing that I know, certainly in relation to the planning applications that come through to Arbury and Rushen, the vast majority of these are approved, aren't they? I think there's sometimes a misconception out there in the general public that planning is there to stop development, but most applications get supported, don't they?
They do. It's interesting you say that, actually, because I think even I would probably have had a perception, because as a politician, you tend to hear about the ones where it didn't go someone's way, as opposed to the ones where everything just ticked through quite normally. And there's also the different routes it can go through. So there are a considerable number of applications which will be decided by an officer. Obviously, ones where there's the requisite number of objections or it meets certain criteria, then go to planning committee. And then there's at the present DEFA applications, or those ones that councillor ministers would call in, go to councillor ministers. So there's different processes, but as you say, the vast majority, in fact, are approved, and part of that as well, and one of the reasons we don't always hit the 8-week which I think is quite an arbitrary number. And if you look at some of the ways they do it in the UK, for example, actually there's a bit of fiddling around with those numbers, so you can't compare apples with apples, so to speak. But actually, when we look at that time frame, I do think that it allows the officers to go back to someone and say, for example, actually, such and such a planning policy would indicate that this could be difficult to accept in the current form, but if you were to change it to a slightly different version, that would be more likely to be acceptable. And certainly from all of the experiences where I've got involved subsequently, either with cases in Douglas East or cases where I've looked back at them post appeal, which obviously is the only point where I can dig into cases because of the function I hold, actually the planning officers have worked with people. They really have. And I would always encourage people to go and speak with the planning officers, either engage someone who can support you with planning through one of the people who are available on the island, or go and work with the planning team, who are more than happy, because ultimately it's in their interest not to have complex queries throughout the process, but to get those ironed out early on and get the process going.
Couple of other things in this consultation. The expanding the minor change provisions so that approvals which incorporate fossil fuel boilers can be amended to remove them. Are we ready for this change? Because we hear certainly from some architects who I've spoken to who say that they're being told that the energy infrastructure, the electricity infrastructure isn't ready to take a significant increase in demand from electrical powered heating systems. Are we ready to make these changes?
So I think we are ready, and we have had a lead in time. We've obviously made a call recently that for those new builds, there was a hope we might be able to bring that forward to 2024, but we've actually acknowledged that would not be sensible or realistic. And that was after consultation with the industry. So we're sticking with the 2025 date. What we're very much looking at doing, though, in terms of the changes with fossil fuel boilers, is focusing on those newer builds or new parts of houses where they have their own heating system. So I don't see this as being a sudden huge shift into electrified heating. I think what absolutely is a valid point is, as we move into the next step, which will be looking at current housing, we know some people, early adopters, are moving into air source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps already, but we also know that there's a significant housing stock on the island that is still heated through fossil fuel heating systems, and it will be really important. I know it's a piece of work we're already engaged with in climate change, in terms of how we do that and ensure that the grid can cope with the demand that will bring. And we know that's the case with electric vehicles as well. So it's absolutely, I believe, the right course of travel. We're in the right direction of travel. But we do have to be aware as we start to do the bigger piece. I'm not concerned in terms of the impact this specific piece would have.
And finally, planning is an essential element of development. Your government is keen for there to be lots of development. How does increasing planning fees help? I mean, it obviously helps your department.
Yeah, but also, we have to acknowledge that planning is predominantly a person-based thing, and we have costs of employment of those people to bear. We've also looked to put additional personnel in the planning department for the very reason we talked about earlier, in terms of trying to process those applications quicker, more efficiently, trying to respond to queries. We would have a few more if we could recruit, because we know it's also a challenging area because it's a very specialist skill. And as much as I hear people's frustration with planning, I can assure you we have an exceptional planning team with a wealth of knowledge, really working full tilt trying to get planning applications done. It's absolutely not the case that they're deliberately disrupting and causing any mischief. They want to get these done, but ultimately there are questions and answers that need to be found. But the fees is essentially to look to try and recover the cost against planning, to make sure that we are achieving what we need to achieve, and making sure we're keeping that in step with where inflation sits.
I mean, it could be argued that rather than handing over large grants to develop luxury flats, maybe that money could be better spent in the department, keep your fees down to reasonable levels, and encourage more people to put in planning applications and get more development moving. That's a possibility, but presumably not one that you think the Treasury Minister would support.
No, I think realistically at the minute we're not in a position where we can drop fees. And I think, when you look at the planning fees and the building control fees as a percentage actually of the overall cost of an average project, I get my words right. Actually, I think that our fees are very fair, very reasonable in terms of that wider cost. We know building construction costs are significant, but it's also really important we get that right, certainly around planning and very much around building control. I think it's absolutely a service that's imperative for us more broadly, and one that we should be comfortable saying there is a cost that comes with that because we need to get it right. So I recognise people would like a dip in fees. I think one of the interesting things actually is some of the organisations that don't pay fees. So obviously local authority is one area. We know that government doesn't pay fees. That's how it's structured at the minute. One of my concerns is more broadly how you then make sure a project is able to fully recover its cost if as DEFA we're picking up the slack there. And that's something I've already spoken to Treasury more broadly about, just us understanding how we make sure that we're properly assigning cost.
For a few people in the Isle of Man, a renegotiated or newly formed Fisheries Management Agreement is exciting news. So you're speaking to one of the people who thinks this is exciting news. Tell us about this.
Yes, it absolutely is exciting news, and it's great to talk to someone who's as equally enthusiastic. But I'd say, we've been working with the Manx Fish Producers Organisation, we've been working with the External Relations team on this, the fisheries officers in DEFA have been working full pelt and with their counterparts in the other jurisdictions. So on the plus side, we're not in isolation. There's a good chunk of people who recognise just how important this is. But we were operating under the Fisheries Management Agreement 2012, which obviously you're very familiar with. And there came an opportunity, because that was predicated on the positioning around the European Union and the accession that we had to that. Actually, the vast majority of it just didn't make sense at the point that Brexit happened. So there became an opportunity to start negotiations with the UK, and we were really pleased to say that following through those negotiations, putting a position together we were happy with, putting that piece of work through the Manx Fish Producers Organisation, making sure we're working with external relations, we have been able to sign a new Fisheries Management Agreement just a few weeks ago that's been signed by all of the nations that are affected by it.
One of the drawbacks of the initial Fisheries Management Agreement, which was agreed back in the 1990s, I think, when we first got further or an extension from the 3-mile limit out to 12 miles, the concern of that initial Fisheries Management Agreement was effectively other, UK countries were able to veto our policies. The 2012 agreement managed to reduce that. I mean, it was still allowed input from the other jurisdictions, but it was very much a case of if you put forward a reasonable case that was well argued and had support from the industry, another government couldn't step in or stop any proposals from taking place. So is that still the case in the new Fisheries Management Agreement?
So the positioning with the new Fisheries Management Agreement is that we have autonomy over our domestic management measures, which I think is really important. And there are still areas which we've agreed, obviously, we would work with. We're not going to go completely lone ranger on this. We want to work with the other fisheries that we have, as I say, regular engagement with from our fisheries officers. But it's really important we recognise the autonomy of our government and our fisheries team to make the right decisions for our waters. And that's been a big piece. And obviously post-Brexit, the UK had far more control over their coastal areas, and that was what allowed us then to formalise an agreement with them on this.
So the advantages then from the new Fisheries Management Agreement, what would you say that are the big changes or the significant improvements?
So the key areas really is around us being able to make decisions specifically in our waters. Some of that will be about some of the access to quota, which we've been able to get as well, which is really positive. Some of that will be around us really looking at what areas we want to protect through our management reserves as well. Those management areas and what controls we might put into what fishing can occur here, I think is really important, because we recognise that there's a huge element of interplay between fisheries and the environment, and that sits really well within the DEFA portfolio. And what we're seeing is through the long-term management plans, actually, for King Scallops, moving into the Queen Scallops area on that, working with DEFA, working alongside the fish producers, actually we're getting to a position where we're able to protect the environment while also preserving stocks for the future. So it really is a win on both fronts.
And if there are any Scottish, Irish or English, or even a few Welsh fishermen listening to this programme, should they be concerned about this new agreement?
So we know that there are still vessels that fish in our waters, but it's right that we're able to set the rules around how that should happen, and that would be the same. We would expect our own vessels to meet those same standards, and those ultimately will be to preserve the future of our fisheries. And in doing so, we recognise there are huge benefits to the environment too.
And we heard in Tynwald, Paul Crane put forward this petition in relation to gaining benefit out to the median line as opposed to just the 12-mile limit. Does government have any appetite to, presumably you will have an appetite to take some money if the United Kingdom government was willing to give it?
And I think that is exactly where the challenge lies. So this has been looked at before, whether it be the continental shelf, whether it be the median line. The reality is that the government hasn't had an appetite to just hand that over, and they have no obligation to either. The agreement that we have between us is different to that between England and Scotland, for example. So as much as I recognise some of the changes that have happened there, we're in a different situation. So absolutely the position that I'm in is that I want to make sure that within what we have currently available to us, we're maximising our opportunities, ensuring that we retain that autonomy and looking to maximise the benefit for the future of the Isle of Man.
And in terms then of the new Fisheries Management Agreement, any bold initiatives that the department's going to be able to come forward with now that perhaps it's been hindered by the previous agreement?
Well, I suppose I'm not going to speculate on anything, predominantly actually because it's a very much a teamwork piece for me. It can't be just for DEFA to do this to those working in the fisheries sector. It's got to be us all working together, and actually that's the beauty of those long-term management plans, because what happens is you've got the right people sitting around the right tables making decisions that absolutely ensure that we've got fisheries that are fit for the future. And for me, that's the biggest win of everything in this. And
perhaps people don't know this, but you have your Scallop Management Board, which includes scientists, officers and fishermen.
Yeah, absolutely. Scientists, officers, fishermen, and fishermen from external organisations as well. So we know we have had representatives from other fisheries. And I think that's what makes it so rich, is actually you're bringing a wealth of knowledge together to make proposals for the future. And I think it's something we should really look to extend across a number of different areas, actually, because having the science to back up those decisions, but also working with the people whose livelihoods are dependent upon them, I think makes an incredibly powerful narrative when we're making decisions. And as I say, allows us to really have that broader view, I suppose, so it doesn't become just one piece. I would be concerned, I suppose, if it was entirely an environmental positioning or it was entirely economic positioning. Actually, doesn't it tie in just exactly with our biosphere reserve status and the principles of that we're looking at the delicate balance that exists between all of those priorities?
That was DEFA Minister Clare Barber. Does the new Fisheries Management Agreement go far enough? Are we right to keep in with our neighbours, or would we be better going it alone? And what do you think of the seemingly innocuous proposal that the Planning Committee should be allowed to consider applications linked to DEFA? DEFA, of course, controls the policy and legislation which the Planning Committee must follow. so some might reasonably perceive this relationship as too close. Don't forget this programme is available as a podcast on Max Radio's website. I'm Phil Gorn, Goramayo, thanks for listening.